Hi guys, before we start chapter number 4, let's recall what we learned in chapter number 3. So, on 12th August 1765, the Mughal Emperor appointed the East India Company as the Diwan of Bengal. As Diwan, the company became the chief financial administrator of the territory under its control. The effort was to increase the revenue as much as it could and buy fine cotton and silk cloth as cheaply as possible. Within 5 years, the value of goods bought by the company in Bengal doubled. Before 1865, the company had purchased goods in India by importing gold and silver from Britain. Now the revenue collected in Bengal could finance the purchase of goods for export. Soon it was clear that the Bengal economy was facing a deep crisis. Artisanal production was in decline and agricultural cultivation showed signs of collapse. Then in 1770, a terrible famine killed 10 million people in Bengal. About one third of the population was wiped out. So, most company officials began to feel that investment in land had to be encouraged and agriculture had to be improved. So, they started with permanent settlement in 1793. By the terms of the settlement, the Rajas and Talukdars were recognized as Jamindars. They were asked to collect rent from the peasants and pay revenue to the company. The amount to be paid was fixed permanently, that is, it was not to be increased ever in future. It was felt that this would ensure a regular flow of revenue into the company's coffers and at the same time encourage the jamindars to invest in improving the land. The permanent settlement, however, created problems. Company officials soon discovered that the jamindars were in fact not investing in the improvement of land. The revenue that has been fixed was so high that the jamindars found it difficult to pay. By the first decade of the 19th century, the situation changed. The prices in the market rose and cultivation slowly expanded. This meant an increase in the income of the jamindars, but no gain for the company, since it could not increase a revenue demand that had been fixed permanently. And now let's see the next type of settlement, which we call it as the Mahalvari settlement. So Holt Mackenzie devised the new system which came into effect in 1822. He felt that the village was an important social institution in North Indian society and needed to be preserved. Under his directions, collectors went from village to village inspecting the land, measuring the fields, and recording the customs and rights of different groups. The estimated revenue of each plot within a village was added up to calculate the revenue that each village, that is the mahal, had to pay. This demand was to be revised periodically, not permanently fixed. The charge of collecting the revenue and paying it to the company was given to the village headman rather than the jamindar, and this system came to be known as the Mahalvari Settlement. So the next one is the Mahalvari Settlement. So it was tried on a small scale by Captain Alexander Reed in some of the areas that were taken over by the company after the wars with Tipu Sultan. Subsequently developed by Thomas Munro, this system was gradually extended all over South India. Reed and Munro felt that in the south there were no traditional jamindars. The settlement, they argued, had to be made directly with the cultivators, that is the ryots, who had tilled the land for generations. Their fields had to be carefully and separately surveyed before the revenue assessment was made. Munro thought that the British should act as paternal father figures protecting the ryots under their charge. Driven by the desire to increase the income from land, revenue officials fixed too high a revenue demand. Peasants were unable to pay, ryots fled the countryside, and villages became deserted in many reasons. The British also realized that the countryside could not only yield revenue, it could also grow the crops that Europe required. By the late 18th century, the company was trying its best to expand the cultivation of opium and indigo. In the century in the century and a half that followed, the British persuaded or forced cultivators in various parts of India to produce other crops like jute in Bengal, tea in Assam, sugarcane in the United Provinces, that is now Uttar Pradesh, wheat in Punjab, cotton in Maharashtra and Punjab, and rice in Madras. So the indigo plant grows primarily in the tropics. By the 13th century, Indian indigo was being used by cloth manufacturers in Italy, France, and Britain. Cloth dyers, however, preferred indigo as a dye. Indigo produced a rich blue color, whereas the dye from woad was pale and dull. By the 17th century, European cloth producers persuaded their government to relax the ban on indigo import. The French began cultivating indigo in Saint Dominic in the Caribbean islands, the Portuguese in Brazil, the English in Jamaica, and the Spanish in Venezuela. By the end of the 18th century, the demand for Indian indigo grew further. Britain began to industrialize and its cotton production expanded dramatically, creating an enormous new demand for cloth dyes. Between 1783 and 1789, the production of indigo in the world fell by half. Britain turns to India. Faced with the rising demand for indigo in Europe, the company in India looked for ways to expand the area under indigo cultivation. From the last decades of the 18th century, indigo cultivation in Bengal expanded rapidly, and Bengal indigo came to dominate the world market. In 1788, only about 30% of the indigo imported into Britain was from India. By 1810, the proportion had gone up to 95%. Attracted by the prospect of high profits, numerous Scotsmen and Englishmen came to India and became planters. Those who had no money to produce indigo could get loans from the company and the banks that were coming up at the time. So there were two main systems of indigo plantation. The first one is niche and the second one is ryote. So within the system of niche cultivation, the planter produced indigo in lands that he directly controlled. He either bought the land or rented it from other jamindars and produced indigo by directly employing hired laborers. The planters found it difficult to expand the area under niche cultivation. Indigo could be cultivated only on fertile lands, and these were all already densely populated. And labor was needed precisely at a time when peasants were usually busy with their rice cultivation. Investing on purchase and maintenance of plows was a big problem. Nor could supplies be easily got from the peasants, since their plows and bullocks were busy on their rice fields, again exactly at the time that the indigo planters needed them. And now let's come to the second type, that is ryote system. The planters forced the ryots to sign a contract, that is an agreement or satta. At times they pressurized the village headmen to sign the contract on behalf of the ryots. Those who signed the contract got cash advances from the planters at low rates of interest to produce indigo, but the loan committed the ryot to cultivating indigo on at least 25% of the area under his holding. The planter provided the seed and a drill, while the cultivators prepared the soil, sowed the seed, and looked after the crop. When the crop was delivered to the planter after the harvest, a new loan was given to the ryot, and the cycle started all over again. Peasants who were initially tempted by the loan soon realized how harsh the system was. The price they got for the indigo they produced was very low, and the cycle of loans never ended. After an indigo harvest, the land could not be sown with rice. So now let's come to the Blue Rebellion. In March 1859, thousands of ryots in Bengal refused to grow indigo, and they fought with Lathials, the lathi wielding strong men maintained by the planters. In 1859, the Indigo ryots felt that they had the support of the local jamindars and village headmen in their rebellion against the planters. In many villages, headmen who had been forced to sign indigo contracts mobilized the indigo peasants and fought pitched battles with the Lathials. In other places, even the jamindars went around villages urging the ryots to resist the planters. These jamindars were unhappy with the increasing power of the planters and angry at being forced by the planters to give them land on long leases. The magistrate Ashley Eden issued a notice stating that ryots would not be compelled to accept indigo contracts. Word went around that Queen Victoria had declared that indigo need not be sown. Worried by the rebellion, the government brought in the military to protect the planters from assault and set up the Indigo Commission to inquire into the system of indigo production. The commission held the planters guilty and criticized them for the coercive methods they used with indigo cultivators. After the revolt, indigo production collapsed in Bengal and it shifted to Bihar. With the discovery of synthetic dyes in the late 19th century, their business was severely affected, but yet they managed to expand production. So that's all for chapter 3. Let's start chapter 4. So, chapter number 4, Tribals, Dikus, and the Vision of a Golden Age. In 1895, a man named Birsa was seen roaming the forest and villages of Chota Nagpur Plateau in Bihar. People said he had miraculous powers. He could cure all diseases and multiply grain. Birsa himself declared that God had appointed him to save his people from trouble, free them from the slavery of Dikus, that is, the outsiders. Soon thousands began following Birsa, believing that he was Bhagwan, that is God, and had come to solve all their problems. Birsa was born in a family of Mundas, a tribal group that lived in Chota Nagpur. But his followers included other tribals of the region, like Santals and Oraons. All of them in different ways were unhappy with the changes they were experiencing and the problems they were facing under British rule. Their familiar ways of life seemed to be disappearing. Their livelihoods were under threat, and their religion appeared to be in danger. What problems did Birsa set out to solve? Who were the outsiders being referred to as Dikus, and how did they enslave the people of the region? What was happening to the tribal people under the British? How did their lives change? These are some of the questions you will read about in this chapter. You have read about tribal societies last year. Most tribals had customs and rituals that were very different from those laid down by Brahmins. These societies also did not have the sharp social divisions that were characteristic of caste societies. All those who belonged to the same tribe thought of themselves as sharing common ties of kinship. However, this did not mean that there were no social and economic differences within tribes. How did tribal groups live? By the 19th century, tribal people in different parts of India were involved in a variety of activities. Some were jhum cultivators. Some of them practiced jhum cultivation, that is, shifting cultivation. This was done on small patches of land, mostly in forest. The cultivators cut the tree tops to allow sunlight to reach the ground and burnt the vegetation on the land to clear it for cultivation. They spread the ash from the firing, which contained potash, to fertilize the soil. They used the axe to cut trees and the hoe to scratch the soil in order to prepare it for cultivation. They broadcast the seeds, that is, scattered the seeds on the field instead of plowing the land and sowing the seeds. Once the crop was ready and harvested, they moved to another field. A field that had been cultivated once was left fallow for several years. Fallow, it means a field left uncultivated for a while so that the soil recovers fertility. Sifting cultivators were found in the hilly and forested tracts of northeast and central India. The lives of these tribal people depended on free movement within the forest and on being able to use the land and forest for growing their crops. That is the only way they could practice sifting cultivation. Some were hunters and gatherers. Okay, so the first figure, figure number 1, it shows women of the Dongriya Kandha tribe in Orissa made through the river on the way to the market. Okay, and the next figure number 2, it shows the Dongriya Kandha women in Orissa take home pandanus leaves from the forest to make plates. So some were hunters and gatherers. In many regions, tribal groups lived by hunting animals and gathering forest produce. They saw forest as essential for survival. The Khons were such a community living in the forest of Orissa. They regularly went out on collective hunts and then divided the meat amongst themselves. They ate fruits and roots collected from the forest and cooked food with the oil they extracted from the seeds of the sal and mahua. They used many forest shrubs and herbs for medicinal purposes and sold forest produce in the local markets. The local weavers and leather workers turned to the Gonds when they needed supplies pusum, of kusum and palash flowers to color their clothes and leather. So what is this sal? Sal is a tree and mahua is a flower that is eaten or used to make alcohol. And from the Khons when they needed supplies of kusum and palash flowers to color their clothes and leather. From where did these forest people get their supplies of rice and other grains? At times they exchanged goods, getting what they needed in return for their valuable forest produce. So what is this figure? This figure number 3, it shows the location of some tribal groups in India. So these are all the tribal groups. We can find it all over India. At other times, they bought foods with the small amount of earnings they had. Some of them did odd jobs in the villages, carrying loads or building roads, while others labored in the fields of peasants and farmers. When supplies of forest produce shrank, tribal people had to increasingly wander around in search of work as laborers. But many of them, like the Baigas of central India, were reluctant to do work for others. The Baigas saw themselves as people of the forest who could only live on the produce of the forest. It was below the dignity of a Baiga to become a laborer. Tribal groups often needed to buy and sell in order to be able to get the foods and to be able to get the goods that were not produced within the locality. This led to their dependence on traders and moneylenders. Traders came around with things for sale and sold the goods at high prices. Moneylenders gave loans with which the tribals met their cash needs, adding to what they earned. But the interest charged on the loans was usually very high. So, for the tribals, market and commerce often meant debt and poverty. They therefore came to see the moneylender and trader as evil outsiders and the cause of their misery. So, some herded animals. Many tribal groups lived by herding and rearing animals. There were pastoralists who moved with their herds of cattle or sheep according to the seasons. When the grass in one place was exhausted, they moved to another area. The Van Gujars of the Punjab hills and the Labadis of Andhra Pradesh were cattle herders. The Gaddis of Kulu were shepherds, and the Bakarwals of Kashmir reared goats. You will read more about them in your history book next year. So let's learn something from the source. A time to hunt, a time to sow, a time to move to a new field. Have you ever noticed that people living in different types of society do not share the same notion of work and time? The lives of the shifting cultivators and hunters in different regions were regulated by a calendar and division of tasks for men and women. Warrior Alwyn, a British anthropologist who lived among the Baigas and Khons of central India for many years in the 1930s and 1940s, gives us a picture of what this calendar and division of task was like. He writes, in Chait, women went to clearings to cut stalks that were already ripped. Men cut large trees and go for their ritual hunt. The hunt began at full moon from the east. Traps of bamboo were used for hunting. The women gathered fruits like sago, tamarind, and mushroom. Baiga women can only gather roots or kanda and mahua seeds. Of all the Adivasis in central India, the Baigas were known as the best hunters. In Baisakh, the firing of the forest took place. The women gathered unburnt wood to burn. Men continued to hunt, but nearer their villages. In Jet, sowing took place and hunting still went on. From Asad to Bhadon, the men worked in the fields. In Kuar, the first fruits of beans were ripened, and in Kartik, Kutki became ripe. In Aghan, every crop was ready, and in Pas, winnowing took place. Pas was also the time for dances and marriages. In Magh, shifts were made to new bewars, and hunting gathering was the main subsistence activity. The cycle described above took place in the first year. In the second year, there was more time for hunting, as only a few crops had to be sown and harvested. But since there was enough food, the men lived in the bewars. It was only in the third year that the diet had to be supplemented with the forest produce. or forest products. So figure number 4, a Santhal girl carrying firewood. In Bihar, 1946. Children go with their mothers to the forest to gather forest produce. So, bewar, a term used in Madhya Pradesh for shifting cultivation. Some took to settled cultivation. Even before the 19th century, many from within the tribal groups had begun settling down and cultivating their fields in one place year after year, instead of moving from place to place. They began to use the plough and gradually got rights over the land they lived on. In many cases, like the Mundas of Chota Nagpur, the land belonged to the clan as a whole. All members of the clan were regarded as descendants of the original settlers who had first cleared the land. Therefore, all of them had rights on the land. Very often, some people within the clan acquired more power than others. Some became chiefs and others followers. Powerful men often rented out their land instead of cultivating it themselves. British officials saw settled tribal groups like the Gonds and Santals as more civilized than hunter gatherers or shifting cultivators. Those who lived in the forest were considered to be wild and savage. They needed to be settled and civilized. So, this shows a log house being built in a village of the Nishi tribals of the northeast. The entire village helps when log huts are built. Then, how did colonial rule affect tribal lives? The lives of tribal groups changed during British rule. Let us see what these changes were. What happened to tribal chiefs? What happened to tribal chiefs? Before the arrival of the British, in many areas the tribal chiefs were important people. They enjoyed a certain amount of economic power and had the right to administer and control their territories. In some places, they had their own police and decided on the local rules of land and forest management. Under British rule, the functions and powers of the tribal chiefs changed considerably. They were allowed to keep their land titles over a cluster of villages and rent out lands. But they lost much of their administrative power and were forced to follow laws made by British officials in India. They also had to pay tribute to the British and discipline the tribal groups on behalf of the British. They lost the authority they had earlier enjoyed amongst their people and were unable to fulfill their traditional functions. So, what happened to the shifting cultivators? The British were uncomfortable with groups who moved about and did not have a fixed home. They wanted tribal groups to settle down and become peasant cultivators. So this figure number 6, it shows Bhil women cultivating in a forest in Gujarat. Shifting cultivation continues in many forest areas of Gujarat. You can see that trees have been cut and land cleared to create patches for cultivation. Settled peasants were easier to control and administer than people who were always on the move. The British also wanted a regular revenue source for the state, so they introduced land settlements. That is, they measured the land, defined the rights of each individual to that land, and fixed the revenue demand for the state. Some peasants were declared landowners, others tenants. As you have seen, the tenants were to pay rent to the landowner, who in turn paid revenue to the state. The British effort to settle Jhum cultivators was not very successful. Settled plough cultivation is not easy in areas where water is scarce and the soil is dry. In fact, Jhum cultivators who took to plough cultivation often suffered since their fields did not produce good yields. So the Jhum cultivators in northeast India insisted on continuing with their traditional practices. Facing widespread protest, the British had to ultimately allow them the right to carry on shifting cultivation in some parts of the forest. So this figure number 7, it shows tribal workers in a rice field in Andhra Pradesh. Note the difference between rice cultivation in the flat plains and in the forest. Now let's come to forest laws and their impact. The life of tribal groups, as you have seen, was directly connected to the forest. So, changes in forest laws had a considerable effect on tribal lives. The British extended their control over all forest and declared that forests were state property. Some forests were classified as reserved forest, for they produced timber which the British wanted. In these forests, people were not allowed to move freely, practice jhum cultivation, collect fruits, or hunt animals. How were jhum cultivators to survive in such a situation? Many were therefore forced to move to other areas in search of work and livelihood. But once the British stopped the tribal people from living inside forest, they faced a problem. From where would the forest department get its labor to cut trees for railway sleepers and to transport logs? So what is this slipper? The horizontal planks of wood on which railway lines are laid. Colonial officials came up with a solution. They decided that they would give Jhum cultivators small patches of land in the forest and allow them to cultivate these on the condition that those who lived in the villages would have to provide labor to the forest department and look after the forest. So, in many reasons, the forest department established forest villages to ensure a regular supply of cheap labor. In this land of the English, how hard it is to live. In the 1930s, Warrior Elwin visited the land of the Baigas, a tribal group in central India. He wanted to know about them, their customs and practices, their art and folklore. He recorded many songs and lamented the hard time the Baigas were having under British rule. In this land of the English, how hard it is to live. How hard it is to live. In the village sits the landlord. In the gate sits the kotwal. In the garden sits the patwari. In the field sits the government. In this land of the English, how hard it is to live. To pay cattle tax, we have to sell cow. To pay forest tax, we have to sell buffalo. To pay land tax, we have to sell bullock. How are we to get our food in this land of the English? So many tribal groups reacted against the colonial forest laws. They disobeyed the new rules, continued with practices that were declared illegal, and at times rose in open rebellion. Such was the revolt of Songram Sangma in 1906 in Assam and the forest satyagraha of the 1930s in the central provinces. So this figure number 8, it shows Godara women weaving. So the problem with trade. During the 19th century, tribal groups found that traders and moneylenders were coming into the forest more often, wanting to buy forest produce, offering cash loans, and asking them to work for wages. It took tribal groups some time to understand the consequences of what was happening. Let us consider the case of the silk growers. In the 18th century, Indian silk was in demand in European markets. The fine quality of Indian silk was highly valued and exports from India increased rapidly. As the market expanded, East India Company officials tried to encourage silk production to meet the growing demand. Hazaribagh in present-day Jharkhand was an area where the Santals reared cocoons. The traders dealing in silk sent in their agents who gave loans to the tribal people and collected the cocoons. The growers were paid rupees 3 to rupees 4 for 1,000 cocoons. These were then exported to Burdwan or Gaya, where they were sold at 5 times the price. The middlemen, so called because they arranged deals between the exporters and silk growers, made huge profits. The silk growers earned very little. Understandably, many tribal groups saw the market and the traders as their main enemies. Figure number 9, it shows a Hajang women weaving a mat. For women, domestic work was not confined to the home. They carried their babies with them to the fields and the factories. So figure number 10, it shows coal miners of Bihar 1948. In the 1920s, about 50% of the miners in the Jharia and Raniganj coal mines of Bihar were tribals. Work deep down in the dark and suffocating mines was not only backbreaking and dangerous, it was often literally killing. In the 1920s, over 2,000 workers died every year in the coal mines in India. The search for work. The plight of the tribals who had to go far away from their homes in search of work was even worse. From the late 19th century, tea plantations started coming up. So, from the late 19th century, tree plantations started coming up and mining became an important industry. Tribals were recruited in large numbers to work at the tea plantations of Assam and coal mines and the coal mines of Jharkhand. They were recruited through contractors who paid them miserably low wages and prevented them from returning home. A closer look. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, tribal groups in different parts of the country rebelled. They rebelled against the changes in laws, the restrictions on their practices, the new taxes they had to pay, and the exploitation by traders and moneylenders. The Kols rebelled in 1831 to 32, Santals rose in revolt in 1855, Bastar rebellion in central India broke out in 1910, and the Warli revolt in Maharashtra in 1940. The movement that Birsa led was one such movement. So about source 3, blood trickles from my shoulders. The songs the Mundas sang bemoaned their misery. Alas, under the drudgery of forced labor, blood trickles from my shoulders. Day and night the misery from the zamindars annoys and irritates me. Day and night I groan. Alas, this is my condition. I do not have a home. Where shall I get happiness? Alas. Birsa Munda. Birsa was born in the mid-1870s. The son of a poor father, he grew up around the forest of Bohonda, grazing sheep, playing the flute and dancing in the local akhara. Forced by poverty, his father had to move from place to place looking for work. As an adolescent, Birsa heard tales of the Munda uprising of the past and saw the Sirdars, leaders of the community, urging the people to revolt. They talked of a golden age when the Mundas had been free of the oppression of Dikkus, and said there would be a time when the ancestral right of the community would be restored. They saw themselves as the descendants of the original settlers of the region fighting for their land, Mulk ki Larai, reminding people of the need to win back their kingdom. Birsa went to the local missionary school and listened to the sermons of missionaries. There too he heard it said that it was possible for the Mundas to attain the kingdom of heaven and regain their lost rights. This would be possible if they became good Christians and gave up their bad practices. Later, Birsa also spent some time in the company of a prominent Vaishnav preacher. He wore the sacred thread and began to value the importance of purity and piety. Birsa was deeply influenced by many of the ideas he came in touch with in his growing up years. His movement was aimed at reforming tribal society. He urged the Mundas to give up drinking liquor, clean their village, and stop believing in witchcraft and sorcery. But we must remember that Birsa also turned against missionaries and Hindu landlords. He saw them as outside forces that were ruining the Munda way of life. In 1895, Birsa urged his followers to recover their glorious past. He talked of a golden age in the past, a Satyug, the age of truth, when Mundas lived a good life, constructed embankments, tapped natural springs, planted trees and orchards, practiced cultivation to earn their living. They did not kill their brethren, their brethren, and relatives. They lived honestly. Birsa also wanted people to once again work on their land, settle down and cultivate their fields. What worried British officials most was the political aim of the Birsa movement, for it wanted to drive out missionaries, moneylenders, Hindu landlords and the government and set up a Munda Raj with Birsa as its head. The movement identified all these forces as the cause of the misery the Mundas were suffering. The land policies of the British were destroying their traditional land system. Hindu landlords and moneylenders were taking over their land, and missionaries were criticizing their traditional culture. As the movement spread, the British officials decided to act. They arrested Birsa in 1895. They arrested Birsa in 1895, convicted him on charges of violating, and jailed him for 2 years. When Birsa was released in 1897, he began touring the villages to gather support. He used traditional symbols and languages to rouse people, urging them to destroy Ravana, Dikkus, and the Europeans, and establish a kingdom under his leadership. Birsa's followers began targeting the symbols of Dikku and European power. They attacked police stations and churches and raided the property of moneylenders and jamindars. They raised the white flag as a symbol of Birsa Raj. In 1900, Birsa died of cholera. Birsa died of cholera and the movement faded out. However, the movement was significant in at least two ways. The first one, it forced the colonial government to introduce laws so that the land of the tribal could not be easily taken over by Dikkus. And the second one, it showed once again that the tribal people had the capacity to protest against injustice and express their anger against colonial rule. They did this in their own specific way, inventing their own rituals and symbols of struggle. So, elsewhere, what's happening in the world? Why do we need cash? There are many reasons why tribal and other social groups often do not wish to used to wish to okay. Uh, Other social groups often do not wish to produce for the market. This tribal song from Papua New Guinea gives us a glimpse of how the tribals view of how the tribals there viewed of how the tribals there viewed the market. We say cash is unsatisfactory trash. It won't keep off rain and it gives me pain. So why should I work my guts from coconut trees for these government mutts? Cash cropping is all very well if you've got something to sell, but tell me, sir, why, if there's nothing to buy, should I bother? Okay, it's very nicely said. Now let's do fill in the blanks. So, number A, the British described the tribal people as wild and savage. Number B. The method of sowing seeds in Jhum cultivation is known as broadcasting. Number C. The tribal chiefs got land titles in central India under the British land settlements. Number D. Tribals went to work in the tea plantations of Assam and coal mines in Bihar. Now let's do true or false. Jhum cultivators plow the land and sow seeds. It's false. They don't plow the land. Then we have number B. Cocoons were bought from the Santals and sold by the traders at 5 times the purchase price. It's true. Number C. Birsa urged his followers to purify themselves, give up drinking liquor, and stop believing in witchcraft and sorcery. It's true. Then for number D. The British wanted to preserve the tribal way of life. It's false. They don't want to preserve. So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.